Hi, church. Good morning. In honor of school starting this week, I thought I would share a few kids' school type jokes to start us off this morning. These are from Boys Life. Who is the king of all school supplies? The ruler. Or who has given, or what in time of school life has given Mr. Bubbles all his nightmares? Pop quizzes. Okay, those two didn't work for you. How about these ones? What kind of school do you go to if you're an ice cream man? Sunday school, a giant. High school, a surfer. Boarding school. And King Arthur, night school. All right, those are my jokes. So at this point, either you are laughing or shaking your head and rolling your eyes, or both. And those are probably the feelings and responses that most teachers are having today. And a lot of those teachers right now are parents. Many of our church families are doing homeschooling for the first full into fall decision. And it's a challenge. Already, I'm hearing from parents, not just only in this community, but in the surrounding areas and in our wider country, that it is a challenge, that it is hard, that it is something that stresses them out. Some of them have expressed already crying in the closet. This is the reality of our world right now. But people do that because they love. So be reminded of that. When you're feeling that you want to shut yourself in the closet because the kids are fighting and it's not working out, just remind yourself what you're doing is because you love them. Now others are back at the school building, and teachers who are professionally trained to deal with this are also rolling their eyes at the awesomeness and awkwardness of their students. Learning is important. And whatever and wherever it's taught, it builds the strength and character of the students who receive it. It not only expands the mind, but it expands the heart and their future to make them better people as they grow. And right now, this is very important. And this is to all of you, everyone watching this. You don't have to be a teacher at home or at school. Right now, our kids are going through something that is going to shape them for the rest of their lives. They're going to probably have PTSD when they come out of this, as are many adults. And I have to say, we've not been good at handling trauma. I was thinking about that this weekend. I was at a Daughters of the American Revolution meeting, and I mentioned to them that, do you know that in this decade, more Vietnam veteran soldiers, our vets who came back, have committed suicide than died actually in the war? That's because we don't handle trauma well. And now we have an entire generation who's going to grow up with that in their background, with that as their baggage. And we have to begin to help them process that so that they can be fruitful and enlivened adults, not held down by what happens this year. Learning is important in the Bible too. Learning is important for our congregations and our people. And how do we know that? Because it says right there in Mark 4, he taught them many things by parables and in his teaching. Jesus was a teacher? Did you know that? Did you know that Jesus taught people things? Sometimes we might forget that, because there's a lot of what Jesus does. We might think more about the healings, or we might think more about the resurrection, but there's a huge section of the Bible that's about teaching. He held school on mountains. He held school beside the water. He held school around the table. He held school in the temple, in the fields. Christianity.com notes. He never entered a classroom as we know a classroom. He never had a degree as we understand an educational degree. Yet all the world was his classroom. Our reading today has him teaching from a boat. As Enduring Word Commentary notes, it probably had good acoustics. Being on the lake, the sound travels easier. And it also allowed him to get away from too many people. Jesus often was overwhelmed by the number pressing in on him. So to center his thoughts, he preached from a boat. But maybe those of you who are teaching at home feel it's a little strange, and you're worried people might look at you differently. But remember this. As that commentary continued, when Jesus taught from a boat, surely it was a new thing. We can imagine some critics saying, "You can't do that. Teaching belongs in the synagogue or in some other appropriate place. It would be easy to come up with objections. The damp air might make people sick, or there are a lot of mosquitoes down at the shore, or someone might drown. But Jesus knew that teaching from a boat suited his purposes well enough. So yeah, teaching can be done anywhere as long as the teacher has a heart for the student or students. We often forget, like I said, that role as Jesus' teacher. We tend to think of him as Savior, as Messiah, as Lord, as Son of God, Son of Man. But many people in his day would not forget this main role for him, because for them, that was what it was about. The learning, the teaching, the sense of being at his feet, where he instilled wisdom upon them. Of the 90 times that Jesus was addressed directly in the Gospels, 60 times he was called teacher. This was the word the multitude used. This was how the disciples referred to him. Jesus himself would use that term when he said, "You call me teacher and Lord." And rightly so, for that is what I am. John 13:13. When Nicodemus came to Jesus at night, he said, "We know that you are a teacher who has come from God." Even the Jewish leaders at that time knew him as teacher. In fact, Scottish theologian James Stewart said, "The teaching of Jesus had the power and an effect with which the influence of no other teacher can even for a moment be compared." Jesus knew all the tricks to keeping the attention of his students. Actually, did you remember that the word disciple means student or learner? So when we say that we're disciples, it's because we're responding to the teacher. Jesus used jokes like I started with today. He told stories. He met them where they were and worked from there. He imparted values and virtues. He invested in their journey. And that's what a great teacher is. Notice I said he met them where they were. In our reading for the week, we see Jesus give them the parable of the sower, a story for many about farming. It's a story about seeds. Okay, now before we get too far into this particular parable, let me address the question that many of you are thinking. What in the world is a parable? What is all this about anyways? And you're right to ask such a question. We don't go around telling parables in today's world. But give them some slack. Back in the day, they didn't have things like emojis. They had to actually speak in words. Parables are full sentences. They're stories. And in fact, they're not as weird as you think. Now, I have to say that I'm going to preface here that what I'm about to say is not agreed with by everybody. There are some theologians and scholars who say that the term parable is only for Jesus' talking. But I disagree. And many do as well. Many stand with me as well, saying that the word parable is actually just a genre of literature. Now, you might be more familiar with Aesop's fables, like The Turtle and the Hare. Now, what is the difference between a fable and a parable? Well, a fable uses animals and plants as their center for the plot, as their main character. But in a parable, humans are the main character. So, really, you can have parables and fables interchangeably, just dependent upon who the main character is, if it's a human one or a non-human one. Now, the word parable itself comes from two words. Para, which means alongside, and bole, which means throwing. So it's to throw alongside. As the Enduring Word Commentary says, the word parable comes from the idea to set alongside. As Jesus used parables, the idea was to set a spiritual truth alongside a daily truth of living. So he's telling a parallel story to how they're already making it through their days. Now, both parables and fables teach us a lesson, with fictional brief story as their format. Writers throughout time have realized that people often learn something about their present reality if we can take their present reality and put it in a different situation. Not sure what I'm talking about? How about this? In a galaxy far, far away, there's a young person growing up who's going to have to decide if he wants to be good or bad. Sounds like what most kids go through, right? But when they put it in a Star Wars format, we don't realize that it's actually about us becoming people and making choices. Right? Things like that happen all the time. There are stories that are taken out of this modern context and put in the past. There are stories that are taken out of this modern context and put in the future. There are stories that are taken out of this modern context and put in a different location, either imagined or real. I was reading an article this week, and they said that they thought our current generation tends more to fantasy than other things right now. And maybe it's because we have to take our reality out and put it in something else. Well, this isn't new. This is what Jesus was doing. He was telling them stories to help them think about who they were without kind of throwing it in their face. Now, kind of in a sense, it's like not hitting them on the head, it's just glossing over. Remember? Alongside. So we have a parable. But why so many about agriculture, you're wondering? Well, it kind of makes sense when you think about it. He's speaking the language of the people that he's working with. When you talk to farmers and people who live off the land, agriculture stories make sense. He has parables about nets. Well, he's talking to fishermen. He has parables about widows and shepherds and Pharisees and tax collectors, and surely those were the kind of people that followed him. They understood the language that he was speaking. Now, if you were to do a parable today, it would probably be different. There might be like telemarketers in it, or shopping center clerks, or maybe McDonald's cashiers, or Amazon delivery people. He would change the format because that's what we know. All right. Why does Jesus do this? Because he doesn't talk over people. He speaks the language they know, because what's the point of telling a story if nobody gets what you're saying? One of the greatest compliments I've gotten on sermons before is when people tell me, I actually understood what you were saying. You helped me clarify everything. That's when I know that I've told a story that matters. If it just glosses over your head, you're not going to instill a message from it. You're not going to change who you are from the story. What's the point of a story if it doesn't resonate within? So, really, he's saying, here, people, is a takeaway. Listen to what I say. So what's our takeaway today? What's Mark 4 telling us? Well, it's the parable of the sower. And now I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to think while I'm reading to you, who is the sower? Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake, while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. He taught them many things by parables, and in his teaching he said, Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants, so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, it grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times. So who is the sower? Did you figure it out? Did you think God? If you did, you were right. God is the one sowing the seeds. Now, what are the seeds? Well, the seeds, Jesus will later tell us, is the good news, is hope, is love, is joy, is a sense of new direction, is a sense of new beginning, is a sense of comfort and forgiveness. It's a better world being offered to you to receive. So who are we in the story? Do you know? Did you guess? You'd be right if you said we are the dust. We are the ground. We are the dirt that the seed is dropped on. Now, why is it called the parable of the sower and not the parable of the dirt? Okay, I don't actually have the answer to this, but I have an assumption. I think it's called the parable of the sower because it's what God does, not what we do. It's God offering freely the good news to us. And yes, we have the opportunity to respond, but it initiates with God. It reminds us, by calling it the parable of the sower, that it's not really about us. It's about God's work. And then whatever we do with it is the next step. As we remember, King Solomon had to ask for wisdom, but we don't have to ask for grace. It falls down from the sky. That's that sowing of the seeds. It falls down waiting to come into you. You have the opportunity on this day to receive that seed. The parable of the sower reminds us that God is already giving us everything we need to be happy in this life. Now, that's kind of interesting, right? Especially in light of what's going on in the world today. There is good and joy falling down on us, and we decide how we receive it. Do we come to it with an attitude of openness to it? Do we come to it with an attitude of doubt and fear and anger and anxiety? Do we come to it kind of indifferent? I don't know how you come to it. And Jesus didn't know either, because in that one crowd, there were tons of people receiving it in different ways. And so he's addressing all the different ways that people could receive the good news. But everything comes from God. Ultimately and freely given, everything good that we can imagine comes from God. I actually truly do believe that. I'm not just saying this. I truly believe the good things in our life are waiting to pour down on us. We have to grab them and see them. Now, usually at this point, I would explain the parable to you. I've done that in lots of sermons before. I've said, here's what Jesus meant. But I don't have to do that, because Jesus himself is actually going to explain it clearly to the disciples. This is a mystery that is revealed. It's like an Agatha Christie that you've read to the end to. You know who did it. You know what this is about. Verse 9 says, Jesus said to them, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. It feels like such a teacher line, doesn't it? As in, listen up, kids. And like most students, the disciples don't get it the first time. And it kind of drives Jesus a little crazy. So shout out to all you parents and all you teachers who are being driven crazy by kids not getting it the first time. Because he says to them, don't you understand this parable? How can you then understand any parable? Again, I've heard this from teachers before. If you don't get this one right, you're not going to understand all the rest of what I'm about to say. For Jesus, this is a base parable that everything comes upon. For Jesus, this is either the one or one of the most important parables in our entire Bible. He lays it out for them so there can be no question. The farmer sows the seed. The seed is the word. And remember, Jesus himself is the word of God that is to be received. So he's kind of saying, hey, look, I'm the one coming to you. Take advantage of me being here. He talks about how the seed is sown on the path. Hear it from God. He tells them that there are some that are going to not receive that. They're not going to take the good, the joy. And I've seen this in my life. People that don't want to be healed, that don't want peace in their life, they like the drama to the point where there's tension in their world. God is offering them a new beginning and they don't want it. There are those people. And that's the ones he begins with a parable with. Then he said there are rocky places with no roots. And I've seen those people too. The ones who say, well, I come to church because my parents told me to, and I still do it because it's what I've gotten used to doing. Adults that say this, not just kids. There are people who never let the roots come into their own decision. There are people who like the idea of Jesus and try it out for a while and say, well, this wasn't for me. That's cool, but not my cup of tea. Or, as Jesus mentioned, there are people who start to believe until something bad happens in their life and they say, well, there can't be a God if this happened in my life. Faith hadn't taken root. The seed dropped, but it wasn't tended to and nurtured. It didn't develop. And that's what this is, a non-developed faith, that rocky path one. Another dirt are those who are on the right path, but then something distracts them from the good news. It could be like money or addiction or lust or any of those 7 deadly sins. The idea that something that's going to pull you away. That's the only thing that makes them, as the Catholics say, deadly. It's this idea that it's something that's pulling you away from faith. What is it? Now, I don't think there's just 7. I think there's lots of temptations in our lives, whatever it is that's pulling you away from God. And, well, Then we hear about the good soil. We hear about people who accept what they're hearing and they produce a crop from it. We've got people who the seed has not just dropped down, but they've developed it, they've tended it, they've nurtured it, and they've made something from it. And clearly he wants his students, his disciples, yes, us too, to be this final soil. We are to be the receptive soil. And did you see there were kind of like three things there? One, hear the word of God, hear it, take it in, right? Hear the good news, the love, the hope, the message that's waiting for you, that's pouring down upon you, the blessings that are coming to you, and accept them. Number 2, accept. Let it change us. Let it make a difference in our lives. Make it own you to become a better person because of it. Make it be present to the message in your life. Let it resonate in you. And then 3, produce. Be a fruitful vine. Make a difference in the world. Don't just think, oh, yeah, I have a happy life, but share it so others can have a happy life too. We are the dust, but we are more than dust. As it says at the funeral, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But we know that we are more than dust. For when God breathed into the first human's nostrils the breath of life, we became living beings. We're not inanimate objects. We can be animated completely by God's love. I found God has interesting messages for us. And for me this week, it was an interesting message to note that this was the verse that I was to preach on in light of the fact that we had a funeral this week for our dear sister Jan, and I had already chosen 2 Corinthians 9, 6-15 to be the passage that we walk her transition into the next stage of her journey with God. It's also about seeds, and it's also about crops and harvest. And when reading these two together, it was interesting to note that it's very similar. In it has the lines, as it is written, he scattered everywhere. He gave to the needy, his righteousness remains forever. The one who supplies seeds for planting and bread for eating will supply and multiply your seed and will increase your crops, which is righteousness. This is exactly what Jesus is saying in this parable. He said it other times too. What I feel, though, that he's continuing to teach them, right, over and over so that they get this message. But there's one really big difference between what we read today in Mark 4 and that 2 Corinthians 9, 6-15. In 2 Corinthians, it makes a point to say that we, in a sense, become a sower as well. We are to take the seeds that have nourished in our bodies and to share them, to have a generous crop into the world, to make a difference. That we have an active step for us laid out in 2 Corinthians. We are to spread the gospel, the good news. We don't just have to be receivers, we can also be conduits that give. Our learning has expected results in that way. Our rich soil that produces fruits can also spread seeds into the world as well. We learn that we can be leaders too. In Mark 4, he's going to keep going down. There's more to Mark 4 than just this first parable. But the first parable sets this whole chapter up. In Mark 4, he's going to continue next with the lamb and the bowl story. The idea of like, don't hide your, this little light of mine, don't hide it under a bushel. No, that part, right? It's a reminder that if you have it inside you, if you've received that message, you should want to share it in the world. You should want to tell people why you're happy, why you're joyful, why you feel that there is hope in a world. And especially right now, when it is a dark world, I want you to think of these quotes. Margaret Fuller once said, "If you have knowledge, let others light their candles in it." Or Father James Keller once said, "A candle loses nothing by lighting another candle." Right? If you have hope, give it to other people. It's not going to dim your hope. It's just going to make the world brighter. Then Jesus says, in verse 24, "Consider carefully what you hear. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you, and even more. Whoever has will be given more, and whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them." So again, he's saying that light will just spread. It's not going to diminish. But if you don't share your light at all, your light's going to get, maybe eventually extinguished. What he's saying is, if you don't embrace the faith and talk about your faith and share your faith, it's going to be hard to keep your faith alive. You might find one day that you no longer believe because you didn't understand what joy was. Joy is not something to be kept inside. Joy is something that's meant to burst out of you. Okay, so you see all these messages are about that first parable at the top. There's even another seed parable. It tells that the God grows seeds within us. And it talks about how that happens at night and how God invested and harvested and all this stuff. But again, just going back to that earlier one, these are all things supporting the earlier one. Even a famous parable supports this parable of the sower. What's that famous parable? The parable of the mustard seed shows up in Mark 4. This is the one who every teacher has probably heard at some point. But teacher, I don't know how to do this. But teacher, I can't do this. But teacher, you fill in the blank. That's the parable of the mustard seed. The I don't think I can. And Jesus says, yes, you can. Just like any good teacher says, try it. See what happens. Take a chance. And the mustard seed is that chance. The mustard seed is the yes, I can story. Yes, I can be the good soil that then produces a harvest that is spread into the world. This whole section, this Mark 4, ends with, it goes on a little bit to talk about the sea scene, and we did that on our Thursday worship. But I want you to think of all these ones before as a passage, a big passage, which ends with this line. With many similar parables, Jesus spoke the word to them, as much as they could understand. He did not say anything to them without using a parable, but when he was alone with his own disciples, he explained everything. He explained everything. He taught them. He invested in them. He cared about them because he knew that their learning would lead to their faith, and their faith would lead to our faith. What he shared with them would become what would be passed down to us. Mary Pope Osborne once said, I love teaching. It's a job that lasts forever. Whatever you teach children today travels with them far into the future. We are the legacy of the faith that was laid down in that boat when he told a story. We are the receivers of the early lessons of faith. We are the fruits of their fruit. So now it's our turn to be disciples, to be learners, to hear, to accept, and to produce a crop. Friends, I'm ready to do this. Are you ready to be the good soil? Now, some of you say yes right now. Others aren't so sure. But know that it's not something that can just click and happen overnight. Jesus, like a good teacher, had to tell them this story over and over again in different ways. And right now, friends, it might be easy for you to say, well, God, I don't know. And that's okay too. But when you think I don't know or I can't, I want you to do what he told us to start with, to hear. Just hear your world right now. Hear the hope, because oftentimes we hear the negativity, but just hear the hope and only listen to that. And maybe if you have to, write it down for a little bit until you can accept it and produce from it. Just start with hearing. And maybe that'll lead you to a better soil. All right, friends, have a great week. Amen.